Just to be absolutely 100% clear, the Earth is a globe. There is no question concerning this. This video will not be about the actual shape of the Earth. Rather, it'll be an analysis of biblical texts and the texts of the surrounding ancient Near East. The ancient Near East, consisting of civilizations like the Babylonians, Assyrians, Hittites, and others, formed the background to the biblical texts. The Bible does not explicitly say whether the Earth is a flat disk or a globe, nor does it explicitly say anything about the perception of the structure of the universe. However, there are a vast amount of clues in the works that point to their model of the cosmos. This will be the focus of today's video. Is the flat Earth biblical? If you have ever seen this image of the cosmic geography of the ancient world, it may or may not elicit some feelings. If you're religious but have a decent understanding of science, you might feel like this is a misrepresentation of the Bible, and that scholars have no clue what they're doing interpreting the texts. If you're religious but have no understanding of science, you probably think this is just how the world is. You'd be wrong, but I understand why you'd think that. If you're not religious, you might see this and go, wow, these religious people really are stupid, am I right? I wanted to approach this as fairly and as clearly as possible, so I'm going to be going over the best evidence from the Bible and the ancient Near East that can help us construct their actual view about this. There's a lot going on in this image. There's a flat Earth, a dome, mountains, a giant ocean, an underworld, and all the other junk. I want to dissect every single part of this and more. I want to explore the texts and archaeological evidence and come to a reasonable conclusion. But for that to make sense to anyone, I need to do some housekeeping. First, I will be arguing for this piecemeal. I'll be going over each piece of this puzzle and putting it all together at the end. I will tell you something in advance though. There is no singular, consistent model to represent the whole of ancient Near Eastern cosmology. The texts that I will be covering span thousands of years and hundreds of miles. The Epic of Gilgamesh may have been written as far back as 2100 BCE in Mesopotamia. The Ugaritic Ball Cycle was probably written around 1500 BCE in Ugarit in modern-day Syria, and the Enuma Elish was probably written near the end of the 2nd millennium BCE in Babylon. I'll be covering later Jewish and Christian works as well to help in this analysis. Over so many centuries, and from so many places, you would certainly expect views to change on these things. There's a reason no one consistent cosmology falls out of these works. If you are unfamiliar with the history of the area, you might be wondering why I find it necessary to talk about this huge selection of works if all I want to do is understand the view in the Bible. You might know that the Bible is not just one book. It's a collection of many works written over the course of nearly 1,000 years. The earliest works stem from Israel. Before it was anything recognizable as Israel, it was the land of Canaan. So the Canaanite background is better understood when we consider the text from Ugarit, which is like right there. In the late 8th century BCE, the Assyrians took over the area and with them came their culture, including their religious works. In the 6th century BCE, the Babylonians took over and exiled many Israelites to Babylon in an event known as the Babylonian exile. When the Persians took over, they allowed the Israelites to return to Israel not too long after. In the 4th century, a little-known king named Alexander the Great swept through the region and brought Hellenistic influences with him. Then eventually we get to the Romans, but no one cares about those guys. The biblical texts were written in this dynamic and ever-changing environment, so it's to be expected that there would not be one consistent view throughout the works. My point is that these texts don't exist in a vacuum. In order to understand their world, we need to view it from their lens. Because of this, we need to understand the influences of cultures spanning from the Babylonians to the Canaanites. Ancient works cannot be taken out of their historical setting. So if you wish to understand them the way that they're meant to be understood, context is the most important tool in a historian's belt. Because of all this, I'll be pulling from a variety of verses and texts. If you want to understand what the Bible says about this stuff, we need to understand what the cultures in the ancient Near East believed about it. But it's important to remember that the span of time and the amount of places that we're talking about, because it means there will be variations in their views. They will not be consistent in every minute detail. To find out if the Bible supports a flat earth, it might actually be important to consult it. I'll be going over a lot of verses in this video, but finding a place to start was actually the biggest stumbling block for writing this. I think a lot of the texts in the Bible are at the very least consistent with the flat earth models of the ancient world, but just picking random verses and talking about them won't do the trick, I don't think. So instead, I'm gonna start off the study with probably the single most important verse in the Bible when it comes to unraveling the cosmology within its pages. While the verse itself doesn't contain all that info, I think discussing the intertext, that meaning other related works from the time or in the genre that might help us understand it, and the historical context will help us in the breakdown of the cosmology. And that verse is Isaiah 40:22. It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in. In context, the passage is more generally about the glory of God and how powerful he is. So the point is really, God is powerful and has the ability to do what he wants with us. But there are a few curious phrases that need to be talked about. These are he who sits above the circle of the earth, who stretches out the heavens and spreads them like a tent. Unless otherwise stated, I will be using the translation in the NRSV UE, currently the most accurate full translation of the Bible available. First, probably the most interesting phrase in the verse, the circle of the earth. How are we meant to take this? I've seen this taken two ways at face value. Critics of the Bible usually jump to, it says the earth is a circle right here, that means flat. Christians and Jews I've spoken to take circle to mean sphere. In fact, this verse was brought up to me in defense of a globe earth in the biblical texts. So from a standpoint of popular opinion, this verse is pretty controversial, but I think we can have a more nuanced view of it. However, the word used is hug. This word always means circle in ancient Jewish literature. Even though apologists often want to understand this word as sphere or globe in Isaiah 40:22 and other verses, this would be a misreading. Circle, in all these texts, is used to describe an actual circle. Here's the entry in Halot, the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. With that in mind, there are only two ways to realistically understand this verse: poetically or literally. Poetically, it could be a reference to the whole world. Literally, the world would be a circle. Let's take a look at a few verses and see what we can conclude. In Proverbs 8:22 through 31, a personified wisdom is speaking. Yes, that means wisdom itself if it were a thinking agent, and describing herself as a being that existed with God at the beginning. Among the many things she's there to witness, she sees when God drew a circle on the face of the deep in verse 27. The passage in Proverbs seems to describe a whole creation story, but unlike the creation story of Genesis, this text describes the molding or shaping of the world during creation from a state of disorder to order, as in God created the heavens and the earth, but they weren't fully defined yet. He had to give them a place, which is why he made firm the skies above and assigned the sea its limits. In this poem, God is putting the finishing touches on his creation. According to Marvin Pope, this circle is meant to be the foundation for heaven and earth. In Job 26:10, Job says, "He has described a circle on the face of the waters, at the boundary between light and darkness." There are different ways to translate this verse. Alter translates this as he draws a circle over the water to the border of light and darkness, and Marvin Pope translates it as he marks a circle on the surface of the water as the boundary of light and darkness. The use of the word circle as describing a boundary that light and darkness cannot cross is the same thought behind the verse in Proverbs 8. The idea is that God has set up the horizon of the primeval ocean. In Job 22:14, Eliphaz creates a caricature of an impious man who essentially says God is too far away to care or pay attention to the pesky humans on earth. While this rhetorical impious man is rebuked, one of the things Eliphaz mentions is that God walks along the circle of heaven. Usually this is translated as rim of heaven, or even understood as dome or vault. However, the word used is hug. What can we conclude from these verses? we have to explain it in a few contexts. Interestingly, all divine contexts. Both passages in Job, the passages in Isaiah, and the passage in Proverbs 8 all talk about circles as they relate to the Creator or his direct creation. This is significant. For the sake of argument, let's say all this is poetic. We have the circle of the earth, the circle of heaven, and the circle on the face of the waters. And the deep is synonymous with the waters, so this covers both of those passages. If we're talking about the creative power of God, and the most it describes is creating the horizon or a Terminator line, his power seems to be diminished. Honestly, kind of lame. If the circle of the earth means the whole earth, sitting above it would be meaningless other than just being outside of it. There's no up or down in space. And the circle of heaven would lose its rhetorical power if we're talking about poetic distance. The distance of God relative to Eliphaz's impious man wouldn't be effective. The spatial distance between God and this man would be infinite or zero depending on how you view the spiritual realm. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's another phrase that is often used in biblical literature that might help us clear up the issue. The four corners of the earth, or sometimes just corners of the earth, kanpoot haaretz. In verses like Job 37:3 and Isaiah 11:12, it's paralleled with other phrases that mean whole or everything. So if we're to take the phrase circle of the earth literally, are we also supposed to take this phrase literally? And if we do, doesn't that mean our model of biblical cosmology would be nonsensical? I mean, how can Earth be both a flat circle and have four corners? I'm no geometry scientist, but I'm pretty sure that's impossible. The only place a squared circle exists is in wrestling. And that's the best joke I'm ever going to write. At the very least, one of these phrases needs to be poetic because otherwise the universal model would be totally inconsistent. Lucky for us, we have the intertext to help us understand the four corners of the earth. The Enuma Elish, an epic of creation from Babylon, mentions that the high god Marduk is given the four winds, which are synonymous with the cardinal directions, by Anu, the god of the sky. These four winds, and similarly phrases like four quadrants of the earth or of the universe, always refer to the cardinal directions north, south, east, and west. This language is also found in the Shamash hymn, a Mesopotamian hymn to the sun god. In the hymn, the world is described as having four regions. This phrase, then, would be indicative of the whole world. What would that mean for circle of the earth? Well, if it was meant to be taken literally, we'd find it in other places, right? I mean, we found phrases like four corners of the earth in the Bible and among Mesopotamian works. Maybe if we look at the same setting for the circle of the earth, we can see what the Mesopotamians generally meant and understand the literary setting for the Bible. Maybe? Let's just see what happens. Here's a variety of Mesopotamian hymns and prayers that talk about the circle of the earth. In these works, the circle of the earth is also neatly paralleled with the circle of heaven, something we saw earlier with the biblical texts. In the prayer to Shamash and Adad brings down rain onto the circle of the earth. There are two hymns to the sun god. One describes the light as being in the circle of the distant heavens, and the other says that the god is the director of people in the circle of heaven. The sky is described as a circle in a hymn to Marduk and a hymn to Nabu. Ashurbanipal's acrostic hymn to Marduk and Zarpanitu says, "You are exalted in the heavens, king of the earth, the skillful counselor of the great gods, establisher of all the habitations, grasper of the discs of the celestial firmament and all the lands." These seem to be establishing and describing the physical boundaries of these realms, and these realms are in the shape of a flat circle. Not only in the ancient Near Eastern texts, but the biblical ones from Job, Isaiah, and Proverbs that we talked about too. But maybe ancient religious hymns were written by the devil or something. How about we talk about something a bit more geographical in nature? Let me introduce to you the Sargon geography. This is a written record of the expanse of Sargon of Akkad's domain. Around 2300 BCE, Sargon united and took over all of Mesopotamia and established the first known empire, Akkad. In later years, people were still writing propaganda about him, but from all available evidence, he took over a huge swath of land. So while there is no doubt mythologizing and exaggeration going on in later periods, the fact is that this was one hell of a ruler. The Sargon geography is preserved in two first millennium tablets. It was essentially all-encompassing, with language that was pretty common to great kings of the period. He ruled over the totality of the land under heaven, the sum of all lands, sunrise to sunset. While this language could certainly be seen as hyperbolic, the areas described would be essentially equivalent to the entirety of their world. That includes the totality of the area from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean and from Anatolia to Iran. The most distant lands are described as being at the horizon, which would make sense. The edges are in Egypt and the mountains in modern-day Turkey. And because it actually gives distances, Horowitz concludes, assuming that Assyria was located near the middle of the Earth's surface, it is possible that the Earth's surface was believed to have a diameter of approximately 4,500 kilometers. This could easily be hand-waved away as propaganda, so I totally understand if you're not convinced that the people of the ancient Near East believed the world was flat. How about a map? This is the Babylonian world map, otherwise known as the Sippar world map. The map is no older than the 9th century BCE, but from what remains, we can actually reconstruct a good deal of Babylonian cosmology. The land, which is depicted as a disk, names places like Assyria, Babylon, Haban, and Susa. The land is surrounded by a large band of water. These waters, which are just labeled as ocean, are surrounded by other regions called Nagu. Considering the use of the word in other texts, Nagu can perhaps be best understood as land separated from you by a large body of water. The Epic of Gilgamesh has the Nagu listed as the first things appearing from the sea after the flood. Other texts describe Lydia as a Nagu across the sea. There's a description of these Nagu on the other side, and we'll return to explore some of them later. But either way, this is an actual map, and not a single part of it actually describes it as being similar to a projection of the globe. These parts are labeled and described, and not a single section indicates that this is simply a two-dimensional rendition of something that is 3 dimensions on a larger scale. Maybe it could be argued that the Nagu are simply representations of other lands beyond the ocean. While that may be true, the fact that no Nagu meets up with another Nagu, connects to another Nagu, or is even implied to, means that the idea this is envisioning anything other than a flat circle kind of falls apart. But maybe neither of those things are convincing to you. Maybe we should take a look at the work of one of the most well-known writers of the time, Herodotus. Herodotus was a well-traveled Greek man that is credited with being the father of history, releasing his work in the 5th century BCE. In Herodotus' histories, he makes sure the reader knows his problems with map makers of the day. He hates the fact that map makers have Europe and Asia as roughly the same size, surrounded by a circular ocean. He points out that they are all very different sizes and says that he understands why they would make the mistake, but the water should not be in a circular shape. His criticism isn't that map makers portray the Earth as flat, rather that the surrounding ocean is portrayed as a circle around the land because the land isn't a circle. The map he had in mind may have looked something like this. This is a reconstruction of the map of Anaximander, a 6th century BCE philosopher. Unfortunately, there's no visual depiction of it anywhere. It's only extant in textual descriptions. The land and the ocean basically form concentric circles. Notice how the middle of the map is always different. This actually plays into all ancient Near Eastern cosmologies. Map makers would often include their primary locale as the center or near the center of their maps, which should be of no surprise. This would change from place to place depending on a variety of biases and propagandistic goals. In the Babylonian world map, the center is not Babylon, but just nearby. On Anaximander's map, it was Delphi in Greece. In ancient Jewish works, the center of the world would be different depending on the text, but often found itself in Eden, Jerusalem, or even Gerizim. This is why in Horowitz's analysis of the Sargon geography, he assumes that Assyria was the center as a starting point to determine the size of the world for them. No matter what angle we take this from, the people of the ancient Near East clearly believed the Earth was literally a flat circle. There are countless references to physical depictions, cosmic circles, corporeal circles, idiomatic phrases, etc., that all point to everyone in the region and time period agreeing with this view. While they may have disagreed on distances or other parts of the cosmology, it should be clear that they all believed the Earth was flat. This includes texts from the Bible and the surrounding cultures. But that's only part of the story. That's just the Earth. I mentioned the Circle of Heaven earlier. It appeared both in the Bible in Job 22:14 and in a variety of other Mesopotamian works we covered. How does that play into the whole system? It's time I introduce you to this, the three-tiered universe. And because the closest I found to a picture of this was, in fact, a cake stand, here's my MS Paint artist rendition of the three-tiered universe. It's beautiful. The best representations from the ancient world, however, come from the Babylonian and Assyrian periods. In these inscriptions, figures, likely gods, are anthropomorphized and depicted in ornate attire. Their lower bodies are covered in what is more or less an ancient version of a kilt, but the depiction on this garb is that of a three-tiered universe. 3 circles, one below another. These are the more general planes of reality, though. Each layer can actually be divided into more specific sections. Let's take a look at 2 texts that should be viewed together. KAR 307, otherwise known as Secret of the Great Gods, and AO 8196. KAR meaning Religious Cuneiform Text from Asher, and AO meaning Oriental Archive, in case you wanted to go find these. These 2 texts describe the division of both the heavens and the earth into 3 sections, upper, middle, and lower. Each of the 3 layers of heaven are made of a different stone and are home to different divine beings. Each of the 3 layers of earth are home to different beings too, from top to bottom, humans, Apsu, the freshwater, and the underworld. Tiers of the universe, or layers of heaven, are not new to religious traditions. The Bible and many apocryphal Judeo-Christian works often talk about the layers of heaven. In the Bible, Paul mentions a man he knew that ascended to the 3rd heaven. The Apocalypse of Paul takes this story and builds upon it more layers of heaven. The 2nd Enoch describes a journey through 10 heavens, and the Apocalypse of Abraham describes the 7 layers of heaven. Actually, as I'm writing this, we just started reading the Quran on our channel, and the Quran says there are 7 layers too. This can actually tell us a lot about the literary context of late 6th century Mecca. Point is, layers of heaven are pretty popular in this religious tradition. Each layer is home to a variety of creatures, celestial bodies, or visions that would be outside the scope of this video to talk about. In the Enuma Elish, Marduk sets up the 3-tiered universe, as any half-decent god should. He connects these by tying them together with ropes. These are the same ropes depicted on the images of the gods shown previously. Ropes were just one way to hold the universe together. Literature and inscriptions from both the ancient Near East and the Bible show that there were other ways to structure the universe as well. This brings me to the next header on my outline. How the hell is all this held together? Marduk used ropes, but pillars and mountains were also incredibly common. A bastion of pillar imagery was Mitanni, surprisingly. Mitanni was a pretty large kingdom in the mid-2nd millennium BCE, just north of modern-day Israel. There have been an astounding number of inscriptions from Mitanni showing the disk of heaven being held up by pillars or anthropomorphic creatures. So this not only takes into account the pillar motif, but the circle of heaven we talked about as well. This is the one good picture I could find, by the way, at least where the disk is explicitly held by pillars. If you want to see a full catalog, you can go to Frankfurt's book Cylinder Seals from 1939. The photocopied version I was using really didn't transfer the images well, but there are many more. I just didn't want to expose you to those eyesores. Here's another from Mitanni. At the top of the inscription, there is the disk of the sky being held up by what looks like lions and birds with one large pillar to hold it up in the center. The Bible constantly talks about pillars too. Job 26:11 says the pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at his rebuke. In Job 9:6, he shakes the earth out of its place and its pillars tremble. In 1 Samuel 2:8, for the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. Psalm 73:3 as well. When the earth totters with all its inhabitants, it is I who keep its pillars steady. I think you get the idea. Mountains were another option. In the Epic of Etana, a Sumerian king, Etana, goes on a journey to the heavens on the back of a bird. I'll come back to it later, but it ends with him seeing the mountains at the end of the world. Mountains at the end of the earth also appear in the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the epic, Gilgamesh goes on a long journey to see Utnapishtim, a Noah-like character who survived the flood. His home is at the end of the world. Gilgamesh travels through some interesting lands during his quest. He goes through a land of scorpion men, he goes over the cosmic mountain, Mount Mashu, through a region of darkness, and finally goes across the waters of death. Each of these areas will be significant to Mesopotamian cosmology, but for now you only need to keep in mind Mount Mashu, the meeting place of the gods that holds up the sky. Actually, there's nothing informative about the land of scorpion men. I just kind of wanted to use this picture of the rock and the Scorpion King. While it may seem strange at first, the association between ropes, pillars, and mountains is actually pretty reasonable. They are all different representations of the support structure of the universe. There needs to be some for heaven and some for earth. But notice how there are both pillars of the earth and pillars of heaven in the biblical texts. In fact, they seem to shake a lot. What's up with that? The shaking of the pillars and mountains is a very common motif of a divine theophany, an appearance of God. It even shows up in CTA 4:7, a Canaanite text in which the mountains quake when Baal, the Canaanite high god in later periods, speaks. The point is the same in Job 26:11. There are two passages that can help us see the relationship of these mountains, the pillars, the heavens, and the foundations of these places in general. I would like to bring everyone's attention to 2 Samuel 22:8, where the foundations of heaven shaking is just part of a divine theophany. God appears in the most fundamental things in the universe, the pillars of the earth, its foundations, the mountains, all tremble. There's actually a virtual carbon copy of this song labeled as a Song of David in Psalm 18, where the only difference is that the foundations of heaven shook is changed to the foundations of the mountains shook. I thought that was super interesting, so I spent a little too much time studying it. Save for one word, the text is exactly the same, so it's clear one used the other as a source, or at least they're both using the same source. I can't say for sure which version came first, but in the poem, David is calling to God for help from the jaws of death. In fact, he is described as being as good as dead. The waves of death encompassed him, and the snares of death confronted him. God heard the cry of David from his temple. In order to get to the earth, he bowed the heavens and came down. But McCarter translates this as spread open the sky, based on the imagery in Isaiah 63. He was also covered in darkness on his way over. There's a lot to unpack in these verses. But for our purposes, we can note that God was in his temple far away when he heard that David was in distress. The temple was in heaven, which he had to almost tear open in order to burst through. I don't have the time or energy to do a verse-by-verse commentary here, but were the heavens and the mountains in this song seen as interchangeable? It would certainly explain why there is a replacement in this one word. But how can we understand this? I think it ties into the motif of the cosmic mountain that I briefly mentioned earlier with Mount Mashu. Cosmic mountains were a very common mythological element in the ancient Near East. Mountains are huge compared to us cockroaches. I could see why people would look at the high mountains and believe that they held up the sky. In some cases, even going so far as to believe that gods resided there, as in the case of Mount Mashu. You're already familiar with a few cosmic mountains, I'm sure. The Bible has Mount Sinai, where Moses receives direct revelation from God. The Greeks had Mount Olympus, the home and meeting place of the gods, and there are plenty more. The Babylonian world map might refer to something like this as well. The northern Nagu is called Great Wall, where the sun is not seen. Why would the sun not be seen in the north? And why would it be called a wall? If it's referring to mountains blocking out the sun, a common Mesopotamian motif, the wall imagery makes sense. There have been plenty of references to the path of the sun encountering total darkness in Mesopotamian epics. Mountains make sense, but I also like the idea of CBF Walker, that it can be called a place where the sun is not seen because the sun, when viewed from the latitude of Mesopotamia, never traverses the northern portion of the sky. It enters it temporarily at the beginning and end of the day at certain times of the year, but never fully passes through it. This is because it's north of the Tropic of Cancer. I'm not sure how much I buy into this idea, but it's definitely an interesting explanation. The third Nagu is said to be unreachable by birds, which is common language used for deserts and mountains as well. So at least some of the Nagu might represent these mountains at the end of the world. One cosmic mountain I haven't mentioned is Mount Zaphon, the name of the Canaanite cosmic mountain where gods like Baal and Hadad resided. Zaphon is actually in the Bible too, but it usually means north because the actual mountain that's being talked about was just north of Palestine. But there's a curious occurrence of this cosmic mountain that I think needs more unpacking. A verse that is often pointed at to support the idea that the Bible is not a flat earth book is Job 26:7, because in this verse we are told that the earth hangs upon nothing. To be clear, it does in fact say that, but I think there is a serious case of cherry picking here. Let's take a look at the full verse. He stretches out Zaphon over the void and hangs the earth upon nothing. Well, that does it. Says right there the Earth is hanging on nothing. This is clearly a reference to the fact that the Earth is floating in space, unattached to anything. What? What do you mean it's not? The story is actually really complex here. On the face of it, the verse doesn't make much sense. What does it mean to stretch out a mountain over the void? Or what does it mean to stretch the north over the void? The possibility has been suggested that Zaphon and heaven would have become synonymous at one point. Since the top of this mountain was considered to be in heaven, housed the divine assembly, and was the abode of God himself, the conflation may have arisen. Roberts argues that Zaphon should actually be understood as the earth here in Job 26:7. He argues for this based on the parallelism of the verses in the passage. In Job 26:6-9, the first and second part of the verses seem to be saying the same thing in two different ways. Sheol is Abaddon, naked means uncovered, etc. Based on this, Roberts suggests that Zaphon and earth are synonymous, making the understanding of the verse, God stretches out the earth over the void and hangs it upon nothing. While that makes a little bit more sense, I think there are layers that are unaccounted for. But before jumping to any conclusions, let's consider the other part of the verse. Where it says that God hangs the earth upon nothing, this is probably the correct reading. There have been others suggested to get around the cosmology question, but they don't seem to pan out well. Robert Alter translates this as, he stretches out Zaphon over the void, hangs earth over emptiness. As in, the earth is suspended over nothingness. But in his commentary on Job, David Kleins explicitly says that it is not suspend over. So it seems there's quite a strong disagreement between these two. While I can't speak to the Hebrew text, it's clear that the Greek translators of the work agreed with Kleins. The translators of the Septuagint, the earliest Greek translation of the Bible, went with ektenon borean epuden kremazon gein epi udenos, which I translate as stretching the north toward nothing, hanging up earth upon nothing. Using epi plus an accusative and epi plus a genitive in the same verse signals to me they use slightly different meanings of the same preposition. According to the lexicon of Liddell and Scott, kremazo means hang up and is often used when hanging up a shield. So to me it seems like the Septuagint translators understood it in the sense of the earth actually not hanging from something. There are a few ways to read this. The most popular one among modern-day Christians is the interpretation that this is talking about the earth floating in space. The thing is, we have no reason to believe that ancient Israel was more technologically advanced than their neighbors, so maybe we need to look at the verse a bit closer. The word used for stretching out here is natah. It can also mean set up in the context of a tent. In fact, it's very often the word used when setting up a tent. So if God sets up Zaphon over the void, perhaps it means he created the holy mountain. If so, why is the holy mountain here called Zaphon? Are we to accept Robinson's claim that Zaphon was a generic term for holy mountain? If we understand it as north, what are we meant to think about when we visualize the north being stretched over or even set up over the void? Does it mean that this was the traditional location of Marduk's acts? Did he stretch out the body of Tiamat from this location, and Job 26:7 simply contains a remnant? Or maybe the original version of this was used for Baal or Hadad, and it was later adapted by the author of Job to fit the context of the story. And because I'm a crazy person, I came up with more ideas. What if it's meant to be about what God can see? Like in verse 6, Sheol is naked and has no covering. God can see right into it. In the same way, Zaphon is over a void, so he can look at it from below and see into it, whether it means the actual cosmic mountain or north. And the earth hanging upon nothing would help God's vision too, because there's nothing obscuring the earth from above. Then it goes on to talk about the actual physical covering of a cloud. Job is a hard text to translate at all, so there are a lot of questions concerning its interpretation. I'll stop babbling momentarily to bring it back and cha-cha real smooth. Remember when we talked about 2 Samuel 22 and Psalm 18, the song that swapped out heaven and mountain? I feel like this might be related to Job 26:7. In those chapters, we see the darkness that God is covered in when God is going to help David. He bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. It's in the area between the earth and God's throne. If Zaphon is the cosmic mountain, which is God's abode, if there was a convention of substituting mountains and heavens, and if this cosmic mountain is stretched over the void, is it unreasonable to think that at some point in time the cosmic mountains in general were viewed as alternate terms for heaven? This would explain why Tsaphon is stretched over the void, and why we have the replacement in the song of two subjects that seem so clearly different to us. Maybe Robinson is right when he says it is more likely that holy mountains were customarily called Tsaphon, and that Zion and the holy place of Ugarit were just two examples of this tendency. I'm not sure how much weight this actually holds, but I'm starting to come around to the interpretation. In fact, it would align with a motif in the Epic of Gilgamesh. I mentioned how Gilgamesh was traveling to the end of the world, and how he had to cross many unique areas. One of those areas was a region of darkness. Maybe it was a common belief that somewhere between the heavens and the earth was a region of darkness that both Gilgamesh and Yahweh encounter when crossing that boundary. It sounds like Job 26:7 has more to it than meets the eye. It ties in beliefs about the heavens, mountains, and their meeting in one neat bow. That leaves us with one big question though. What does hanging the earth upon nothing mean? Ancient commentators understood this in some unique ways. Because they had no concept of gravity and believed the earth was the center of the universe, this verse had to make sense in their cosmological model. Olympiodorus the Deacon says that the support of the earth is nothing but an understructure, but it is suspended and sustained by divine will. In his first homily on the Hexameron, a fancy Latin word for the first 6 days of creation, Basil the Great essentially agrees with this when he talks about the nature of the earth. When I first read his thoughts on Isaiah 40:22, it kind of seemed like he was dodging the implications entirely. In the Ancient Christian Commentary series, basically a compilation of Christian commentaries that are presented in a verse-by-verse style, Basil is quoted as essentially ignoring the meaning of the stretching of the heavens. He moves immediately to, well, let's talk about the earth instead. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. So I went ahead and read the whole homily. The argument is essentially that we shouldn't try so hard to understand the earth or the heavens in full because it would break our feeble little minds. But when actually addressing the shape or nature of the earth, he goes off on a series of hypotheticals. If the earth was on air, it would fall right through it. If the earth was on water, it would sink. If the earth was on something solid, it would have to be heavier than the earth, because the earth is on top of it. If that's the case, then those solid things would need to be held up in some way, lest they fall through the void. Remember, at this time, people thought the universe was geocentric, so everything was moving around the earth. Basil goes around the question by literally saying that God's got the whole world in his hands. However, I think the answer to this is probably a lot simpler. It might be a callback to the idea of the bonds or ropes that Marduk sets up. In any case, they would be denying its reality, which is fine because it had been a long time since the Enuma Elish was written. On the other hand, my mind jumps to one thing. The earth isn't hanging on anything because it's set up on pillars. You don't have to hang from something when there's something beneath you holding you up. I just spent what looks like 4 pages rambling about the things that hold up the sky, but we haven't even talked about the nature of the sky. When we think of a firmament, we think of a dome with all these stars on it, but that's the super simple version. In biblical texts and the rest of the ancient Near East, the firmament was just one of many layers of the heavens. I talked about the KAR text earlier. You know the one with the division of the heavens and the earth, where each one is divided into 3 distinct layers. I mentioned it almost in passing, but it describes what each layer of heaven is made out of. Each of the layers are made of a unique stone. You might be wondering, who the hell cares about what the layers of heaven are made of? Especially if they believe it was made of flippin' rocks. I'll tell you who cares. People from a long time ago, that's who! The middle layer of heaven was made out of a blue stone resembling lapis lazuli. If you're a frequent reader of the Bible, this might remind you of something. In Exodus 24, Moses and the gang are going up to Sinai, but they see something very special. They see God himself on his heavenly throne. Look at how this scene is described. Then Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel went up, and they saw the God of Israel. Under his feet there was something like a pavement of sapphire stone, like the very heaven for clearness. The sapphire stone is usually understood to be lapis lazuli, but since the word is sapphire, some scholars, like Robert Alter, believe it is a cognate of sapphire and should be understood as sapphire. Either way, we're talking about a pavement of blue stone in the heavens. Obviously, this is a reference to the blue sky, but the Bible's inclusion of the same imagery is no coincidence. In the ancient Near East, it was common to portray the blue sky as a layer of blue gemstone. This same layer tends to house a god, Yahweh in the case of the Bible, and Bel in the case of KAR 307. Another piece of info I conveniently left out so I could mention it right now. There's another very important passage we need to talk about to get a fuller view of this layer of heaven and its nature. That passage is Ezekiel 1. Of all biblical passages, this is often listed among the wildest. Ezekiel sees a lot of crazy stuff, but all in all, it's a vision of God. He sees a fiery human figure, creatures with 4 faces and 4 wings, wheels covered in eyes, and the throne of God. This clearly falls into the category of a theophany in appearance of a deity. The fire and storm imagery make it clear. Fire and storms were commonly associated with the appearance of a god. Van Setters notes that one of the prominent features of theophany that persists in Mesopotamian tradition is the emphasis on the terrifying splendor, Malamu, attributed to various gods in the hymns. This appears in the Bible many times as well. We even talked about one of these occurrences earlier. It was in Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 22 where God appears to David. God is given a nose, a mouth, and even feet. It anthropomorphizes God and adds the fire motif. Ezekiel's vision contains the same thing. A similar motif is in Daniel's vision of the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7, where the heavenly throne is surrounded by fire. But I think the nature of theophany in the Bible is best exemplified by the kavod, or the presence or glory of Yahweh. It shares the closest association with the Mesopotamian idea of Melamu. Before talking about that though, I want to point out that Ezekiel isn't quite seeing God. Instead, he's seeing things like heavenly objects. Like in verse 5, in the middle of the fire was something like 4 living creatures. And in verse 22, where seated above the likeness of the throne was something that seemed like a human form. This is significant because in many biblical texts, seeing God himself was dangerous, even life-threatening. A good example of this is in Judges 13:22, where Manoah, the father of Samson, says, "We are doomed to die, we have seen God." He actually saw an angel, but that's a whole other theological debate. Point is, he believed he saw God, so he was afraid he was going to die. This is why Ezekiel is very clear that he is seeing the likeness of these things. That view wasn't always true, by the way. Isaiah, for example, actually sees God in Isaiah 6. This is probably the best depiction of what I'm talking about when it comes to kavod and Melamu parallels. This is a Mesopotamian relief of the storm god Asher from the 9th century BCE. Not only does it contain the fire imagery combined with the anthropomorphism, but it has warrior imagery that is associated with Yahweh as well. We should continue on from Ezekiel 1:26 though. The creatures that Ezekiel sees are holding something up. Here's the full verse. "And above the Raqia over their heads there was something like a throne, in appearance like sapphire, and seated above the likeness of the throne was something that seemed like a human form." The throne of sapphire is similar to what is described in Exodus 24, where we see something like sapphire beneath God's feet. And just so I don't get called out on this, it should be clear that according to verse 22, above the creature's heads is the Raqia, and it's described as being clear. Above the Raqia is the throne of sapphire. If you don't know Hebrew, you might be wondering what the hell this Raqia thing is. It's translated in many ways, including dome, vault, firmament. I want to leave it untranslated for now because I don't want to put the cart before the horse by translating it as dome or vault. In any case, this is what the creatures have above their heads. So what is this Raqia thing? The same word appears in Genesis. In Genesis 1:6-8, God creates the Raqia, and God said, "Let there be a Raqia in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the Raqia and separated the waters that were under the Raqia from the waters that were above the Raqia. And it was so. God called the Raqia sky. Easy enough. The sky separates the waters here on earth and the waters in heaven. The Raqia is just the sky. Pretty simple. That was a lie. It's not simple at all. The root of the word means spread out. So something is being spread to divide the waters. The issue is that in the form it appears in Genesis, it adds an incredible amount of intensity. so much so that the root in this form often appears alongside metalworking, like in Job 37:18. Can you, like him, spread out, Raqia, the skies, hard as a molten mirror? It's usually understood as something hammered out, like a shield or a sword. With that in mind, we're clearly referring to something solid. But if that's not enough, let's take a look at some other verses in Genesis 1 just a few lines later. God creates the sun, moon, and stars, but in Genesis 1:17 it says he sets them inside the Raqia. In Genesis 1:20, the birds fly across it. The same phrase is used in Genesis 1:2, where the Spirit of God swept over the face of the waters. The birds fly across the face of the waters. They are not inside the Raqia like the stars, they're just below it. This suggests that the Raqia is solid because the birds aren't flying inside of it, but right up against it. Furthermore, the phrase al-paneh implies a concrete object. It's clear that the people of the ancient world viewed it as solid. The Septuagint translators use the word stereoma, which according to Liddell and Scott's Greek-English lexicon means a solid body. Other contexts for the word are still suggestive of strength or solidity. There's a lot where that came from, by the way. Let's take a look at a few of the early commentators and their thoughts on the subject. In his first homily on Genesis, 3rd century church father Origen says the firmament was the physical heaven and all corporeal, physical objects are firm and solid. 3rd Baruch, in apocryphal text from around the 2nd century CE, says that when Baruch is being shown the layers of heaven, he is told that the builders of the Tower of Babel were trying to figure out the material the heavens were made out of. They were trying to reach the physical Raqia. Not only was there discourse about what it was made out of, but they also believed they could figure out how thick it was, like in the Babylonian Talmud Hagigah 13a. Now is there not from the earth to the firmament a walking distance of 500 years, and the thickness of the firmament itself is a walking distance of 500 years, and a similar distance exists between each and every one of the firmaments, and above them, above all the firmaments, are the divine creatures. Not only have they determined the distances between the ground and the first layer of heaven, but they acknowledge that there are other layers of heaven with the firmaments separating them. The firmaments here being multiple Raqia. We already talked about a number of layers, so I won't go on about it, but it should be abundantly clear that all available evidence from the ancient world supports the idea that the sky was solid. I felt like translating it as dome or vault would carry assumptions about its shape and material nature that I wanted to avoid. I've actually really been appreciative of Carr and Prop's translation of Raqia as plate, because I feel like that more honestly resembles the ideas floating around in the ancient Near East. While I think this translation is better, I will use terms like firmament from now on to refer to the Raqia, as it would be easier to understand out of context. So let's turn back to Ezekiel 1. The creatures that hold up the firmament are described in a special way that may not be significant to people who don't study this stuff, so I want to bring your attention to it. After describing the many faces and multiple wings of the living creatures, we hear this description in Ezekiel 1:7-8. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings on their four sides, they had human hands. Now I want you to look at this image. These are Neo-Assyrian reliefs showing bull-legged men holding up the platform of the sky with a god shown sitting on top of it. It contains both the imagery of Malamu, or splendor, and the winged and bull-legged men holding up the sky, just as is described in Ezekiel 1. It should be clear by now that what is being described is the presence of God in his heavenly throne, but the throne is shown exactly where it was thought to be, above a solid firmament carried by bull-legged men, just like in other places in the ancient Near East. But if the firmament is actually solid, how can the stars and other celestial bodies fit inside of it? I've got bad news for you. People in the ancient world didn't know stars were huge balls of hot plasma in space. Shocker, I know, but what did they actually think about the stars? Well, they didn't have an exact method of figuring that out, but for the most part, they believed that these were divine beings in one way or another. Sometimes the stars, including objects we would identify as planets or comets, were seen as part of God's entourage. The nature of this isn't super clear because sometimes they thought of them as more physical and other times as more spiritual. J.J. Collins, one of the most prolific scholars on Jewish apocalypticism, notes that the stars were the visible manifestation of the heavenly beings, but the precise relationship between them is elusive. The stars may have been seen as part of El's heavenly family at some point, but according to Smith, there doesn't seem to be a consensus on that. For context here, El was the original high god of the Canaanite pantheon before Baal took over. When there was a new cult favorite god, they would take on the attributes of the gods that were fading in popularity. Oh, your god created the world? That's cute. Mine did it too, but with guns and a monster truck. You get the idea. Perhaps the Baal tradition didn't include the astral divine family stuff, but the El ones did, so when Baal became the preferred god of Canaan, he engulfed the astral family of El. Later, Yahweh came along and, through an act of divine cannibalism that hasn't been seen since Vince McMahon defeat God at Backlash 2006, engulfed that attribute too. There are a lot of hints in the biblical text pointing to stars being divine beings. My favorite example is in Daniel 8:9-10, where a metaphorical horn grows so big that it is said to grow as high as the host of heaven. It threw down to earth some of the host and some of the stars and trampled on them. The host of heaven is the whole group of celestial bodies. They're talked about whenever God is referred to as Lord of Hosts. Patrick Miller puts it well. There was a cosmic dimension to these wars, for the Lord came to battle with a myriad of holy ones. Even the stars fought for Israel. The whole assembly of heavenly beings belonged to the Lord's army and were at his command when the Lord came and fought for Israel. And since we've been talking about Job a lot, let's talk about him again. Job 38:7 mentions this heavenly host as well, where the stars and the B'nai Elohim, sons of God, sing. The morning stars sang together, and all the heavenly beings, B'nai Elohim, shouted for joy. In fact, this caused such a kerfuffle later that the scribes that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls, manuscripts written between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE, changed the reading to say that the stars shined instead of sang. There's honestly so much that I want to talk about when it comes to the host of heaven and the celestial army, but it's actually so far outside the scope of this video that I'm just going to stop myself. And if you want to learn more about that stuff, you can read Mark S. Smith's The Origins of Biblical Monotheism. It's pretty dense, but I think that he provides a lot of evidence and explains it very well. In any case, from the language used of the stars in the ancient Near East, it seems they were considered to be somehow embedded into the heavens. In fact, they often used words like drawn or inscribed. In the Labu myth, Enlil draws a constellation in the heavens. In Enuma, Anu, and Lil, it says that Anu, Enlil, and Ea draw constellations in the sky. In a hymn to Asher, these stars are referred to as writing. Back in our discussion about KR 307, I mentioned how the heavens are made of stone. The text doesn't just say what it's made out of, but continues to describe it with a couple of very interesting details. The lower heavens are jasper. They belong to the stars. He, Bel, drew the constellations of the gods on them. What can we tell from all this? It looks like the stars are placed on the face of the lowest firmament, the lowest layer of heaven. That's why we can see them from Earth. There's no pesky firmament in the way. It's the lowest one. And because they don't really move much relative to each other, it makes sense that ancient people likened it to a drawing or an inscription. This fits well with the idea that the stars were created within the Raqia in Genesis. This understanding didn't really change either. Berakot 32b, probably composed during the 1st or 2nd century CE, still contains this interpretation. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to Israel, "My daughter, I created 12 constellations in the firmament." Interestingly, in the 4th century, people generally believed the stars were fixed. But in his catalog of heresies, Bishop Philaster blasts people who believe God doesn't set the stars every night. The stars aren't fixed. God needs to set them every night. He literally claimed it was against Catholicism to believe the stars were fixed. He still believed in a celestial sphere, but the stars had to be placed anew in the evening. For reference, these were in a time when a celestial sphere concept was gaining some traction. So now we know what the ancient people believed stars to be. But even though they were believed to be embedded or drawn on or just angels, they still needed to enter the sky somehow. The most frequent way to explain their appearance was through a series of gates. These have actually already been mentioned in a lot of the texts I brought up already, so it should be clear how ubiquitous this idea was. So I'm going to circle back to a few things. First, the Babylonian world map. One of the Nagus, specifically the 8th Nagu, is said to be in the east where the sun rises. It actually uses the word used for gates to describe where it enters. In the Etana epic, Etana, who's flying on the back of an eagle, needs to enter through different gates in order to pass from one path of heaven to the next. Each layer of heaven needed to be crossed, and in order to do that, you had to go through a gate. He passes through the gates of Anu, Enlil, and Ea. Then he passes through the gates of Sin, Shamash, Adad, and Ishtar. From this high vantage point, he sees the earth getting smaller, and he can see more and more of it. He sees the ends of the earth. The world is described as a small garden, while the waters surrounding the land are seen as a massive ditch. The ocean is encircling the land entirely and is described as the land's border. In the exaltation of Ishtar, Anu, Enlil, and Ea assigned the moon and sun gods their heavenly duties, meaning they were assigned their pass through the sky. In order to pass into the sky from below the earth, they had to open the door of Anu, heaven. In the Akkadian Adapa myth, Adapa goes to heaven on the path of heaven to the gate of Anu, which further shows the connection between Anu and this celestial path of heaven. In the myth of Nergal and Ershkigal, there is a stairway of heaven that led to the gate of Anu. I'm sure you get the point. In order to traverse the heavens or even enter them, there was a gate that the celestial bodies had to come through. The motif of heavenly gates wouldn't gain popularity in Abrahamic traditions until later, especially with 1st Enoch. The scholarship behind this book is pretty complicated, but it was completed sometime in the 1st century CE and builds on the character in the Bible, Enoch, who's the first person to ascend and walk with God in Genesis. Part of the text is called the Astronomical Book, which is a very detailed description of how the stars move through the sky. It's filled with examples of gate language. In the Apocalypse of Paul, a text from the mid-3rd century CE, an angel is taking Paul through the layers of heaven. Upon stepping on the firmament, Paul says the angel led me over the gates of heaven. In order to get into the sky, they had to go through these gates. Different gods had control over a different track in the sky. They had a very interesting way of portraying this, and for that I need to remind you of that thing in Ezekiel 1. We talked about the creatures holding up the firmament and God's throne above it. I also briefly mentioned wheels covered in eyes. These things have confused people for a long time. Sometimes you'll find the meme floating around about biblically accurate angels. This is what they're referring to. These aren't quite angels though, so the meme is wrong. But in later Jewish works like 1st Enoch and the Talmud, they would be included as angels, but it's not clear from the text itself. But they still look weird as hell, so let's talk about it. In the vision, there is a platform with a throne on top of it. Below the platform are the beings with the 4 faces. Right next to those beings are these wheels that move in every direction the 4-faced creatures do. From the description, it seems like they're wheels within wheels, and they have a ton of eyes all over them. This image is probably the most accurate to the textual description if you haven't read the whole thing. The imagery here is probably based on the cherubim motif in Ezekiel 10, where they also have 4 faces with wheels and eyes all over them. These have been interpreted in a lot of ways. Some people have thought these were meant to represent actual wheels, as in it was modeled off a real-life wheel in the ancient world and all the eyes were actually nails or something. Others believe the whole system is supposed to be a divine chariot, but the motif was actually seen in other places in the ancient Near East. Take a look at these inscriptions. This is Persian period artwork depicting a wheel beneath the sky. It's not entirely clear what it was meant to represent, but there are some working hypotheses. The most popular one seems to be the interpretation that these represent the movement of the heavens, probably based off their observations of the celestial bodies. Partially because of this evidence, Eulinger and Mueller conclude that the vision's concern for the coordinated movement of the bodies described could then be understood as a reflection on the movement of astral spheres, which move along individual circular paths, but at the same time remain connected to one another by some invisible commanding principle whose technical rules cannot be easily put into words. What you see on screen now might look like some concentric circles divided into many parts with some words scribbled in all the sections. On some level, that's exactly what that is, but the story behind its use is far more interesting. This is a Mesopotamian astrolabe. You might be familiar with astrolabes. It's a tool used to help determine the altitude of stars. They were probably invented around the 300s BCE, somewhere around there. They are still used today, but in a much more updated form. What you might not be familiar with is this Mesopotamian version of the astrolabe. The term is technically a misnomer because these were more like star catalogs. They're a lot closer to a star chart or calendar than they are to the actual scientific tool we call an astrolabe. They would identify a month with the appearance and disappearance of a star. Each of these stars are set in a certain path of the gods, the paths of Ea, Anu, and Enlil. The same gods that set the constellations and the same ones whose gates Etana needs to pass through. There were two ways they used the appearances and disappearances of the stars. The first is more like a modern written catalog or a list. The other resembles a star chart. This is the circular star chart one. This is inscription CT3312, and here is a reconstruction of the whole from Horowitz's Mesopotamian cosmic geography. I thought this would be important to bring up because whenever I watch flat earth debates, my guilty pleasure, sometimes I'll hear the flat earther bring up Mesopotamian astrolabes, and the globe earther would say something like, astrolabes didn't exist yet, so that's impossible. I think this might be the culprit. My guess is that the flat earthers heard about Mesopotamian astrolabes without actually looking at them too hard, and assumed they had the same function as a modern one. Mesopotamian astrolabes are real, but it's definitely a misnomer. There was a really interesting comment from Eulinger and Mueller that I wanted to share. Rotating an astrolabe allows the simulation of stellar movements, and consequently such an instrument is but an obvious reflection of the notion of astral regularity and coordinated movement. It was this concept underlying the astrolabe which eventually gave rise to the circular zodiac in the 5th century BCE. These astrolabes probably have their origin in the Middle Babylonian period, and would date to around 1300 BCE. So not only does it make sense that the movement of the whole system of stars as one unit would be represented by something like this, but I thought it was really fun to see the roots of the zodiac that far back. Either way, this was a cool candidate for the meaning behind the crazy wheels in Ezekiel. It's not clear that the wheels in Ezekiel or the wheels in the Assyrian inscriptions represent the whole course of the stars, but it's a really cool hypothesis. It might just mean mobility in general, but the fact that the wheels in Ezekiel 117 don't change direction as they move speaks against that. The jury's still out on that one. The gates are arguably part of the sky, but they're also kind of part of the earth. This is where the heavens and the earth intersect. And it's important to understand the beliefs about the meeting point. It was significant not only in the ancient Near East, but even in later Christian literature. It's really interesting how all over the place this motif seems to be. We talked about the idea that there were mountains at the edge. The 8th Nagu is a great example because it combines not only the imagery of a mountain at the edge of the world, but also the gate where celestial bodies enter through. But it seems like this edge is always at the horizon. And at this horizon, heaven and earth meet as a crossroad of the interstellar highway. In Bitrim Ki, for example, a medicinal incantation text, the sun god rises from the great mountain, the place where heaven and earth embrace, at the horizon. Going back to the Apocalypse of Paul, we can learn more about this meeting place in the same chapter. He took me down from the third heaven, and led me into the second heaven. And again he led me on to the firmament, and from the firmament he led me over the gates of heaven. The beginning of its foundation was on the river which waters all the earth. And I asked the angel, and said, Lord, what is this river of water? And he said to me, this is the ocean. In this text, the firmament meets the earth at the waters of the ocean, the horizon. In that place is a gate that allows travel between worlds. It acts as a crossroad between heaven, earth, and hell. In the Canaanite Baal cycle, we see a similar motif concerning the meeting place between the heavens and the cosmic waters. Anat, a goddess, travels to the ends of the earth to see the high god El. We travel to the ends of the earth to the edge of the abyss. At the edge of the world, at the intersection, is the source of the two rivers, where El is always described as being. So we start to see a mix of ideas in these texts. Sometimes the ends of the earth are mountains that act as a gate for the celestial bodies. Other times the ends of the earth are the source for the cosmic waters. The waters flow in from one world into ours and provide the source for all the waters on Earth. There's a very good reason for this I want to come back to, but I want to remind you what I said at the beginning of the video. There is no one consistent view portrayed in these texts because we're talking about a variety of related cultures over the course of thousands of years. However, we still find plenty of similarities because they are still related. There's a common set of beliefs about these topics that changed and adapted over time and place. We have many parallels that seem to have held for a long time, but the small details could have been totally different. We talked about a ton of stuff already, so let's do a quick recap. In these ancient texts, the Earth is a flat circle, often paralleled by a circle of heaven. There are many layers of the universe, and the heavens themselves are divided into layers. In order to hold them together, the texts often describe mountains, pillars, or ropes. These objects supported the sky, which was believed to be a solid firmament. Whether that was a dome or not will be further addressed later, but it was certainly solid. In some cultures, it was depicted as being held up by bull-legged men. On the face of this firmament, the stars were inscribed, and these were often believed to be angels or divine beings in some form. In order to enter the sky, they had to enter through gates, which could be found at the edge of the world, where the heavens and the earth meet. This meeting place was believed to be the source for the major bodies of water on Earth. I know that's a lot, but there will be a test at the end. Viewed together, these beliefs form the background of one part of Isaiah 40:22, the circle of the earth. But what about the rest of the verse? The curious phrase, stretches out the heavens, actually explains why the cosmic waters are at the end of the earth. The phrase stretches out the heavens has been used by Christians to say the Bible is scientifically accurate. In case you didn't know, the universe is expanding. At an increasing rate, by the way. But this video isn't about that. It's about the Bible and the ancient Near East. Since the discovery that the universe is expanding, believers have insisted that the biblical authors had knowledge of this. It says in Isaiah 40:22 that God stretches out the heavens. How would the biblical authors have known this? Obviously, this means that Isaiah received divine revelation and recorded it in his work. What do you mean it doesn't mean that? The truth is, this verse has a fascinating mythological background, and it all stems from the Enuma Elish. In the Enuma Elish, before the naming of heaven and earth, there was a mixing of the waters of Tiamat and Apsu. Apsu represents the underworld and the fresh water, while Tiamat is the chaos water that was understood as salt water. These two were once one until Tiamat got fed up with the fact that Apsu wouldn't tolerate her bullshit anymore, so she sent him away. Interestingly, only the Enuma Elish in Genesis mention the separation of the waters into two parts. Many myths have the separation of sky and earth, but the waters separating are unique to these two creation stories. Other times, earth and heaven were created separately and began as an abyss. The Enuma Elish continues by mentioning the fact that the new god on the scene, Marduk, is given the four winds, the cardinal directions by Anu. Later in the work, we have a cosmic battle between Marduk and Tiamat. He divides the sea, Tiamat, in two. He takes the lower body of Tiamat and uses it to form the earth. Then he takes her upper body and does something very interesting with it. At this point, I'm sure you can pick up the parallels with other texts we've discussed, but this next bit is pretty enlightening. One half of her he set up and stretched out as the heavens. He stretched the skin and appointed a watch with the instruction not to let her waters escape. He made the regions of heaven, earth, and the Apsu, the three-tiered universe. Later, Marduk divides the sky and sets up the course of the year. He made gates and boundary lines for the months and their associated stars, just like in the astrolabes we covered. It is said that the heights of heaven are in Tiamat's belly and that the stars are set within her. Her eyes form the sources for the great rivers, the waters of heaven, the Tigris and Euphrates. Marduk sets up great bonds that hold together the three-tiered universe. In fact, this inscription I showed you earlier with a god dressed in an image of the three-tiered universe is actually Marduk. Interestingly, Marduk says that he made Babylon as the midpoint between the Apsu, the underworld, and the heavens. It is beneath the celestial parts whose floor I made. This fits into the center of the world motif we ran into before. So that's where the whole stretching of the heavens imagery comes from. In the ancient Near East, a commonly held view preserved in the Enuma Elish was that the body of the primordial chaos waters was stretched out to build the heavens. But the stretching of Zaphon over the void back in Job 26:7 might be related to this as well. We talked about a few hypotheses, but I think some of it is at least tied together here. If God is enthroned on the holy mountain, the peak of which is the firmament, a belief we already discussed, then it makes sense to say Zaphon, one of the most quintessential cosmic mountains around, was stretched out over the void. Hopefully that makes sense. The Baal cycle we talked about earlier references the idea of the cosmic waters being the source for the earthly waters too, when El is said to be at the source of the two rivers. This Canaanite myth has another layer of complexity too when we talk about the story of Baal and Yam, the sea god. Yam tried to enslave Baal, but he wasn't having any of that, so he beat the hell out of him and took him captive. Here, I want to be transparent and say the translation and why its text isn't super clear. There are a couple possible ways to interpret the passage. You could say that he destroyed Yam or he drank him, which is much cooler, by the way. But either way, the story ends with "Our captive is Prince Yam." After that, it seems like Baal dealt the final blow and Yam was officially dead. Yam being described as a captive is not at all that dissimilar to the cosmic waters of Tiamat being held in by Marduk's appointed guards. Remnants of this myth found their way into the Bible as well. Maybe we should go over a few verses. Just to stick to the theme of Job, we'll stay there, at least for now. He alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. Job 9:8. This might seem innocuous, but there's an Ugaritic cognate for waves here that means back, so it might have been understood as trampling on the backs of the sea. Understanding backs as heights or waves would make the myth seem to disappear. But Job is actually filled with knowledge about the myth of cosmic sea monsters. Just take a look at Job 3:8 or 7:12. Furthermore, in this verse, we see the beloved phrase stretching out the heavens. We already talked about where that came from, but it should be noted that this kind of language always appears in later texts, like here and Deutero-Isaiah. Not just in Isaiah 40:22, by the way, but in Isaiah 44:24 as well. And if you're furiously typing away in the comments about how Job is the oldest book in the Bible, you're wrong, but this video isn't about that. Job 26:12 is a good place to check for this motif too. In verse 11, we talked about the complexities of the shaking of the pillars. Remember, we're still in a divine theophany here. Robert Alter translates this verse as, "Through his power he subdued Yam, and in his cunning he smashed Rahab." The words are often translated as sea and storm, but the words literally are Yam and Rahab. These are different names for the sea god that Yahweh, or Baal, defeats. There's also Job 38:8, which says, "Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb." It goes on to say that he set bounds for it, bounds which we already covered, and set bars and doors. Once again, we have the barring of the sea motif that was used in both the story of Baal and Yam and the Enuma Elish. Horowitz compares the language in this passage to the motif of the net of the sea, which holds back the waters in many Babylonian texts. There's a bunch more too. Psalm 89:9 says a similar thing about the subduing of the waves in the sea. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. In the Bible, there are clearly remnants about the myth of the defeat of the primordial sea. The stretching of the heavens calls back to this idea, so the texts include motifs about the captivity of the sea and the holding back of the waters. The sea was destroyed, stretched out, and its waters held back. All these narratives contain the story about the cosmic waters being overcome. In the case of the Enuma Elish, Tiamat is turned into the equivalent of the firmament. In the story of Baal and Yam, Yam is eventually destroyed after an apparent period of captivity, short as it is. We know that the heavens that are stretched out in the Enuma Elish are synonymous with the Raqia, or the firmament, because of their function. Not only are the stars set in them, but they also contain the source for the cosmic waters. We talked about how there was this idea of the cosmic ocean that was receiving more water from the ends of the earth, but it always appeared in slightly different forms. In the Egyptian view of the cosmos, with Geb and Nut, that would be the earth and the sky respectively, we see some familiar motifs as well. Pyramid text 1039-40, a funerary text, tells us some revealing information concerning the interaction between the sky and the cosmic waters. "Greetings to you, waters. which we brought by shoe and lifted up by the two sources, in which Geb bathed his limbs, so that hearts were in the following of fear and hearts were in the following of terror. The deceased was born in noon, when the sky had not yet come into being, when the earth had not yet come into being, when the two supports of the sky had not yet come into being. So even in Egypt, we have references to the two supports of the sky and the idea that the cosmic waters are the sources for the two primary bodies of water for Egypt, the Nile and the Mediterranean. So the waters were held back at the end of the world, but the story doesn't end there. The water is actually all around the firmament too. That makes sense for the Enuma Elish, where the sea is literally turned into the firmament, but in other cases, that's not what happens. Even then, we still have hints that water is somehow above the sky. So let's take a look at a few examples. The waters above and below the earth are described in KTU 192, the myth of Uftart the Huntress. This is a fragmentary text from Ugarit which mentions that there was a lower deep, implying an upper deep. The same idea is in Genesis when we consider that there were the upper and lower waters, in Genesis 1:6-7. It's no surprise that we see some of the biblical texts reflecting this belief. During the flood, the windows of heaven opened to let the waters in. While that could be poetic language for clouds, the mythical background to the creation account makes it unlikely. Furthermore, Job 38:22 talks about the storehouses of snow and hail. This usually is seen to be rhetorical language that basically means people don't know what God knows and he's got it all under control. But the thing is, Job 38 contains so many ancient Near Eastern motifs from mythology that I think the idea of this doesn't fit into the same context is super unlikely. This is the same chapter that mentions the springs of the sea, the recesses of the deep, the gates of death, and the gates of darkness. Job 38:16-17. Language that directly points to things like the entry to the underworld being at the end of the cosmic sea. This is the same chapter that is influenced by the ancient conception of the stars being divine beings that form a council. That was Job 38:7, which we discussed before. But let's see what some early commentators had to say about this concept of the waters above the firmament. Genesis Rabbah 4:3a says, Rabbi Pinhas says in the name of Rabbi Hoshea, equivalent to the space between the earth and the firmament, so is the distance between the firmament and the upper waters. Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, at the midpoint between them. Rabbi Tanuma said, had it been stated, God made the firmament and he divided between the waters that were on the firmament, I would have said that the upper waters rest directly upon the firmament, but since it says and the waters that were above the firmament, it indicates that the upper waters are suspended above the firmament by the word of God. So in this rabbinical view, the upper waters are as far away from the firmament as the earth, just in the opposite direction. The early church father Ambrose had a similar view. In his Hexameron, remember that's the fancy word for the first 6 days of creation, he had a lot of, let's say, negative things to say about the astronomers of his time. Also, before you ask, a lot of people wrote commentaries on the Hexameron, so you'll find a lot of books about the same thing with the same name, all by different people. Ambrose's was just one of many. Ambrose was a 4th century church father who, in his commentary on the second day of creation, expressed anger toward those that believed in a celestial sphere that rotates with no water above it. No, according to Ambrose, those pesky astronomers had no right to question God because the firmament divided the waters and continues to. So yes, he believed that there was water above the firmament, and any opinion otherwise was blasphemous. So there were waters above the firmament, and they were like held in prison or something, with the rest of the earth getting its water trickled in somehow from the edge of the earth. That's cool and all, but what does it mean? Well, it means that the Bible contains a lot of references to the surrounding mythologies. The authors knew what types of stories they had to tell to get their rhetorical goals across, and using myths the nearby cultures were familiar with was a great way to do it. So Yahweh was now one of many god concepts that defeated the primordial sea, stretched it out, locked it up, set out the cosmos, etc. These were just the ways people glorified their gods in the ancient world. Now, back to my framing device, Isaiah 40:22. There's another hint at the story of the destruction of the sea aside from the stretching of the heavens. That would be how the verse starts, where God sits above the circle of the earth. I kind of hinted at this earlier when I mentioned the Ugaritic cognate for waves that meant back, but what I didn't mention was all the stuff I'm going to talk about now. German scholar Klaus Balzer understood sits in this context as enthronement, so he translated it as enthroned above the circle of the earth, which makes sense if we consider the verse directly following it, where God is described as the one who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. But this isn't simply about the imagery of enthronement. No, it's a callback to the idea of the defeat of the sea. In Psalm 89:9, where it says, "You rule the raging of the sea, when its waves rise, you still them," the inclusion of the word ruled and the mythological context led Frank Moore Cross to translate this as, "You rule enthroned on the back of the sea." This obviously includes the enthronement motif and the understanding of a back instead of the waves or heights, both of which make sense considering the next verse. "You crushed Rahab like a carcass." We even get more of this in Psalm 29:10, where God is enthroned over the flood. It makes a lot of sense that the imagery of God trampling on the sea is viewed as his divine enthronement, considering the background mythology we just covered. Every single time Yahweh kicks another god's ass, he's taking his rightful place at the head of the table. Apologies to my tribal chief. A lot of wrestling jokes in this one. I'm getting a kick out of it. A drop kick out of it? Okay, I'll stop. The last part of Isaiah 40:22 that needs to be covered is the tent imagery. I mentioned already how the Hebrew word for stretching out is often used in setting up tents. With that in mind, I want to draw your attention one last time to the Baal cycle. After visiting Baal, the goddess Anat sets out to see El, the chief god of the Canaanite pantheon. She tells us exactly where he is. She set her face towards El, at the source of the rivers amidst the springs of the two deeps. She rolled back the tent of El and came to the pavilion of the king, the father of the bright one. There's a lot in this singular passage. El being at the source of the two rivers calls back to the idea that the cosmic waters flow into the earth from the edge of the world, where the springs of the two deeps meet. That part is, of course, a reference to the idea that there is water above the firmament and below the earth. Here, she also rolls back the tent of El to get to his abode. We talked earlier about the stretching of the heavens like a tent in Isaiah 40:22 and the location of the cosmic mountain. From my perspective, it seems like the entrance to the heavens is at the end of the world, and the sky, the firmament, is the tent that needs to be opened to enter. From there, you can easily get to the top of the cosmic mountain. In this case, it may or may not be Tsafon. In some Ugaritic literature, Tsafon is associated with El, as in the phrase El Tsafon or El who creates Tsafon, but I should be clear that earlier in the story, Anat had just met up with Baal on Tsafon. In any case, the verse about Tsafon being stretched out over the void might be related here too. It seems no matter what I do in this video, Job 26:7 is in the background waiting to cash in its money in the bank contract. Get out of here, Job 26:7! This video isn't even about you! I lied about the wrestling jokes. If this interpretation is correct, then the stretching of Tsafon over the void implies that the firmament is stretched out in Canaanite thought as well. If that's the case, then the rolling back of the tent of El would be the core myth behind the tent language. When Anat rolls back the tent of El, I always picture it like the scene in The Truman Show, where Truman finally escapes. When it comes to Isaiah 40:22, 5th century theologian Theodoret took it literally when he said, "For since the earth is like the ground floor of a house, and the sky simulates a roof in the form of an arch and dome, he has aptly compared it with a tent." People interpreted these verses in all sorts of different ways before modern science gave us some pretty concrete answers. Sometimes the stretching of the heavens was thought to refer to the amount of people worshiping and glorifying God, or the sustaining of their existence. The foundations of the earth were sometimes seen as preachers. The pillars could be angels. There's a whole bunch of interpretations. I already mentioned the people that took this stuff literally in a more cosmic sense, but I wanted to end on this note. Some verses that seem to point to this cosmology, whether they be the ones that I covered here or ones I decided not to cover, may indeed be poetic, but the fact that not a single verse contradicts the other ancient Near Eastern cosmological models should be cause for concern. If you are of the opinion that the Bible is a flat earth book, great, me too. But if you're not of that opinion, I want you to seriously consider these verses. There's a certain word, kadur, which in modern Hebrew means ball or sphere. And I probably mispronounced that, but whatever. In the Bible, it means something like mound or turban. That's how it's usually translated, probably because they're vaguely spherical in shape. But if the biblical authors believed the earth was a globe, they probably just would have called it that. Every time we find a hint of cosmology in the Bible, the language is rooted in the mythological background of the ancient Near East. This isn't a surprise, by the way, nor is it a bad thing. I happen to think holy books are way more interesting when taken in their proper historical context. None of these books are written in a vacuum, so if you want to understand what the authors are talking about, you need to know about the time they're writing in. That doesn't just mean what the authors are telling you, but what the authors aren't telling you. It requires reading between the lines and reading the intertext. So when studying any ancient religious environment, you need to be aware of the styles of the time. What did the surrounding cultures believe? Why? What were their rituals? How long did they do them? Everything. The more you understand the ancient world, the more you understand the works that come out of it. It is the height of hubris to assume that you today could totally understand a religious text, or any text for that matter, from 2,000 years ago or more without that background knowledge. Cultures changes, language changes, motifs change. It's an entirely different world, and acting like you can understand it without considering its surroundings suggests you have a bigger ego than Hulk Hogan leading up to SummerSlam 2005. I also want to state something explicitly here because I know it won't be clear unless I say it. But the Bible should not be viewed as a ripoff of these mythologies or plagiarizing them somehow. These were the popular storytelling motifs of the culture. If you wanted to describe the creation of the universe, you would use and adapt a basic outline of tropes for your own purposes. I think the Aeneid is actually a really good example of this. Virgil essentially wrote a story of the forgotten hero in the Homeric works because that hero, Aeneas, was viewed as the progenitor of the Romans. Because Virgil wanted to write the best Roman propaganda, he took his minor character and turned him into an Achilles-like hero. Virgil uses so many images and motifs from Greek literature that you can't even fully tell it's Roman propaganda until the vision of Caesar Augustus. My point is that Virgil didn't rip off the Iliad and the Odyssey. He repurposed their stories for his own goals. The same is found in biblical texts. Everyone believed that a deity had created the world with certain properties. If you want to tell people about your creator deity, you use the language of that time to do that. The deeper we look, the fuzzier things get. We're talking about texts from different times and places. While there are both historic and cultural ties between, say, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, there is currently no way of knowing precisely how their cosmologies line up with each other. Second, these could have changed over time or even could differ from person to person. They contain an incredible amount of similarities because of their close connection, but we can't cherry pick evidence from each time and place to describe one consistent model of the universe they all believed. We have many parallels that seem to have held for a long time, but the small details could have been totally different. This would explain a model of the universe like this common dome image. Simply put, it's our best estimate of an ancient worldview. Aside from this image of Geb and Nut from Egypt, no text explicitly talks about a dome over the earth. The reason why the idea is held in scholarly circles is because it is the best model that explains the ideas like the cosmic waters being held in, and the fact that gates for the stars don't really work on a cosmology of a universe that has tiers like plates suspended one over another. I mentioned before how some texts are inconsistent when it comes to whether or not the cosmic ocean was at the end of the earth or the cosmic mountains. This is a very general model that holds for most cosmologies of the ancient Near East, but it's not one that can be used in all cases. We need to have a nuanced approach when talking about these things since we don't want to be anachronistic. Honestly, I think a diachronic study of this stuff is needed in order to say what the exact views were at the exact times and places the biblical authors were writing, but in lieu of such a study, we can only do our best with what we have. So what have we learned? From a very general standpoint, one could call this image of biblical cosmology accurate. But we need to understand that because the Bible has its origins in the mythic motifs of both the land of Canaan and Babylon, it's going to retain hints from both. Also many other places, because the diaspora was more than just to Babylon, but that's a different issue since these two still would have been the biggest influences. The earth was considered flat. The Raqia, the firmament, was solid, and while it is not described as a dome explicitly, it's hard to imagine how the holding in of the cosmic waters would work without it. However, some language used to describe the universe, like the circle of heaven and circle of earth, suggests the view in the Enuma Elish of these heavenly plates. The land is encircled by the cosmic ocean, which may or may not have had mountains around it too. The stars are some kind of divine beings, and they exist in the plate of the sky in some way. In the Bible, the earth is set on pillars, and sometimes the sky is too, but this may have been changed to mountains later. I could go on, but I think those are the big points. The main point is that the Bible is a product of its time, so it retains many remnants of the mythological settings of the area. It is entirely consistent with those cosmologies, but again, it should be noted that even those cosmologies and the remnants in the Bible itself do not point to one wholly consistent worldview. This is the image you can associate with ancient Near Eastern cosmology, but remember, there is slight variation. I worked for 2 years on this video. I researched, wrote, and edited this thing, and it finally feels like the long haul is over. So hopefully this video doesn't flop. That would suck. But I feel like the work I put in was valuable to this discussion. I want to thank the lovely people in my Discord that helped with the Hebrew, and my friends who both fact-checked the script and helped me format it in such a way that would be understandable to lay people. Thanks for watching, and a special thank you to all of our patrons for their support. We couldn't do this without you. If you haven't yet, be sure to like and subscribe. If you enjoy our content and want to help support this channel, check out our Patreon and Teespring links in the description. If you don't want to spend money but still see what we're doing outside of YouTube, make sure to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We're also live on this channel every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Central Standard Time for the Quran readings, so don't miss the live show. We'll see you next time.